Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I'm here today with Dr. Beau Branson. I think you might be reclaiming your title of the
Oh,
most frequent guest on my channel
am
and
I?
stealing it back from my friend Luke Thompson. So,
Oh, okay. I thought I saw someone that you'd read a bunch of church fathers with, and
oh, well, I guess
he was on.
Hank. I mean, Hank
Yeah, that,
is my
yeah.
co-host of the
Oh,
Church
okay,
Fathers
okay.
series. I'm
That's
not
right.
sure if he counts as a guest. He just kind of lives in the house already.
Okay,
So other than Hank,
sure.
my Church Fathers co-host, you, I believe, are the most frequent guest
Yeah, wow.
and the first guest, and now the most recent guest, the Alpha and Omega guest, as
Right.
of
Wow. Wow. I'm very privileged.
So for anyone who doesn't know, Dr. Beau Branson has a PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame University, and you're a professor of philosophy at Brescia University in Owensboro, Kentucky.
Hmm. That's right.
And you are a Eastern Orthodox philosopher, and especially in sort of the analytic philosophy school. And
Hmm.
so today we are killing two birds with one stone. I kind of wanted to talk to Beau because we are doing Gregory of Nyssa right now in my Church Fathers series with my friend Hank. I'm like, oh, it would be great to get Beau on to talk specifically about Gregory of Nyssa and his Trinity.
Hmm.
And then the Four Views book came out. I'm trying to talk to all the authors, although William Hasker might be a slight exception, four of the authors of the Four Views book. And I've also talked to Chad McIntosh about the Four Views book already. And Dr. Ryan Mullins, he's sort of like the editor of the series or something like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. The series
and
editor.
the host of the Reluctant Theologian podcast. And so now I get to talk to you hopefully about both of those things because it's pretty
Yeah.
similar. Your
Sure.
book chapter focuses a lot on Gregory of Nyssa. And
Yeah.
so without further ado, do you want to kind of dive right into Gregory of Nyssa, who he is and why you think he's important and relevant for this conversation?
Yeah. So we think of the Arian slash Trinitarian controversy kind of happening in the 4th century, obviously starting with Arius and his bishop Alexander of Alexandria. And that kind of leads to the First Ecumenical Council in 325. And St. Athanasius was there at the time as a deacon. He later became the patriarch, and he's kind of thought of as he's kind of a protagonist, I guess, if you're Orthodox. During the 4th century, kind of for defending the Council of Nicaea. After Constantine, all of his descendants in the Constantinian dynasty were all sort of Arian or semi-Arian leaning kind of
A
people.
couple exceptions, it sort of tended to hopscotch back and forth somewhat
Sure.
dramatically from emperor to emperor. And Julian the Apostate was neither. He was a
Yeah.
neo-pagan.
Yes.
So
But definitely not Orthodox.
right.
He kind of favored the Arians too, though, a little bit. But
He seemed to
um,
favor chaos among the Christians
true.
to try
Yes.
and bring them down. Yeah.
But in any case, the controversy still. Sometimes people present it as like the Council of Nicaea sort of settled the whole thing, but really, that was kind of I don't know. I mean, it was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of the next in this whole controversy. And really, it's probably more accurate to say that the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381 was kind of the end or the beginning of the end of the whole controversy. So, as Athanasius is getting older, you have the next sort of major characters in this thing are the Cappadocian Fathers. So Saint Basil the Great, his younger brother Gregory of Nyssa, who I'll talk about a little more, and then Basil's good friend Gregory Nazianzus. They sort of people tend to think they maybe started off sort of semi-Arian or something, but they end up anyway, at least being Orthodox and being kind of champions of the Council of Nicaea. And anyway, eventually Saint Basil died just right before the Second Ecumenical Council, So Saint Gregory of Nyssa, his younger brother, and Saint Gregory Nazianzen, his friend, were both at the council. Gregory Nazianzen was the president at one point, but he kind of got disgruntled and really he didn't really exactly leave. He sort of issued an ultimatum, and people were like, "Okay, leave." He's like, "Okay, I will." So anyway, it ended up Gregory of Nyssa that was there through the whole thing, and most scholars today would say, sort of in antiquity, Gregory of Nyssa wasn't, I guess, as I don't know, focused on as the others, but today scholars would say, in some sense, he was kind of the mastermind behind the theology that really eventually gets accepted at the Second Ecumenical Council. He was, he gave kind of like an opening speech and stuff. While he was there, he was in the middle of writing his Contra Eunomius, which was this book against Eunomius, was a kind of infamous Arian, extreme Arian, who Basil had written a book against, and then Eunomius wrote a book against him. And so Gregory was kind of trying to defend Basil, and he was writing that and reading drafts of it to Saint Jerome and Gregory Nazianzen and people while he's there. And actually, even at the end of the council, when the emperor Theodosius, who had called the council, kind of issued a decree, basically sort of defining a Catholic Church in terms of, agreeing with this theology. The way that law was written, basically the legal definition of a Catholic Church essentially was you agree with St. Gregory of Nyssa about the Trinity. It was basically the gist of it. So, they sort of listed like specific people in different regions of the world. And it was like, if you're in communion with this guy and this guy and this guy. And it actually did happen, I think, once at least, that, some bishops' orthodoxy was kind of called into question. And so they, had Gregory of Nyssa travel out to interview him and this sort of thing. So the reason that I focus on that, that's kind of the reason I focus on him, is it's sort of like he's such a central figure in the whole, the whole story and kind of the eventual outcome of like what is going to be the official doctrine of the Trinity in the church. That I think it would be sort of crazy to question whether his theology counts as a version of the doctrine of the Trinity. Because one of the questions that kind of comes up sometimes, most people don't address this very directly. Dale has a little bit, and I have, but there's the question like, what does a model of the Trinity, quote unquote, have to do to be Trinitarian? Like, a lot of people just sort of assume whatever they come up with, if it's sort of trying to be Trinitarian, then that's Trinitarian. But then, you'll have someone criticize someone's model of the Trinity and say, well, that's really just kind of a version of modalism.
Yeah.
Or, this is really Arian, or this is really tritheistic, or whatever. So there's a question kind of like, well, what does a view need to do to be Trinitarian? And, there can be some controversy about that. So I just think, well, let's take this guy who's kind of central to the whole thing. And if he doesn't count as Trinitarian, no one would.
Right. So make the Trinity Cappadocian again.
Yeah, maybe I could get some little baseball caps.
But yeah, I sort of agree with that general historical framing. That I think that a lot of the way that the Trinity gets framed now is very kind of strangely anachronistic, or of a much later sort of flavor of what it would mean to count as a doctrine of the Trinity. Right. And like the Trinity's shield lays heavily on people's mind, right? Yeah. That sort of
which is like
right, which is like a medieval thing. The Athanasian Creed kind of weighs heavily on people's minds, but that's sort of a later forged document, and other things
for
like that.
For a long time in analytic philosophy, the Athanasian Creed was kind of like, well, we can start with this, and let's see if we can analyze this. And yeah, it was so frustrating. And me and Scott Williams and people would kind of commiserate about this, because it's like, this is a forged document. Like, it's not a creed. It wasn't written by Saint Athanasius, and that's literally all we know about it. Is that it's not. And also, it was something that was never. I think it was pretty much unknown in the East for quite some time. And then by the time it was finally translated into Greek, even then, it was translated like without. People would translate it into Greek, but take out the part that sort of sounded like the filioque. So anyway, it's never been sort of like authoritative in the East. So yeah.
And
so
then another
places
weird thing about that is it became adopted as authoritative by many different Protestant traditions.
Oh yeah,
which I think
it
is also somewhat strange, because it was considered very authoritative within the Catholic Church at the time.
Yeah, that's
right. And so, like, almost all Calvinist churches and Lutheran churches and things along those lines will have the Athanasian Creed as part of their, I don't know, requirements or list of authoritative documents or what have you.
Right.
And so, I the idea that you just need to have three persons, one God somehow out of the deal, and that there's this thing called the doctrine of the Trinity that has these certain rules or constraints to it. Some of it makes sense to me for historical reasons, but a lot of the way that modern people talk about it just seems very kind of, I don't know, contrived or ahistorical or something like that.
Yeah, the first paper I ever actually published was a paper called Ahistoricity in Analytic Theology, and I tried to kind of make the point, like, why, just from in a purely logical sort of analysis, like the way that people approach things, it's not. I mean, sometimes people don't know, like, kind of what does this amount to ahistorical, like, why, who cares, what does this mean? But I kind of tried to show that it really just results in invalid arguments, because, like, if I just say, here's my model of the Trinity, it's coherent, and then I conclude, therefore the doctrine of the Trinity is coherent, like, that's a non sequitur, right? I'd have to show that my model of the Trinity either has the same logical form as the doctrine of the Trinity, or it logically entails the doctrine of the Trinity, or something that, if my model is coherent, then it would follow that the doctrine of the Trinity is coherent. But I tried to argue that, and I sort of mentioned this in this book chapter, but I didn't, have time to flesh it out much. But basically, I just argued that by the time, if you actually tried to support that premise, that missing premise, what you would have to do to be able to show that that's true would actually make the model irrelevant. Like, if you could do what it would take to show that connection, you could have just started with the doctrine of the Trinity and forgotten about your model, and you'd already. So it's kind of, I just think this sort of talk about models, sometimes I use that term, but I think it's kind of silly. Yeah.
So let's dig into the history just a little bit more. Like, you gave a good high level overview. Particularly important for seemingly the Cappadocian Fathers was arguing against this guy named Eunomius and his friends. And that a lot of the theology that we have of theirs that is forming the doctrine of the Trinity is in books written against Eunomius or someone similar to Eunomius. And so what was sort of the state of the argument at that time, and what was sort of the landscape, and how is that shaping their approach?
Right. It's a good question. And it's, I would say, ironically, you might sort of credit Eunomius with kind of the triumph of Trinitarianism in the first century, even though he was totally against it. And the reason why is sort of, Arius himself, and a lot of these early Arians were, in a lot of ways, in many ways, much closer to Nicene Trinitarians than Eunomius was. And so kind of early on, it was kind of like, well, it's this big controversy. But then people take all of these kind of middle sort of positions, kind of trying to not be so extreme on one side or the other. So you get this, like, homoousios in the Nicene Creed. The Father and the Son are co-essential, consubstantial. With Arius, they're just not. But then you have people saying, well, they're homoiousios, or homoia, whatever. What the phrase is.
Homoian, right?
Yeah, homoian. So some people would say they're similar according to essence. They have a similar essence. The homoians, just say like, well, let's just say they're similar.
And leave the word
just kind of leave
essence
it at
out
that,
of it.
right? Like
Yeah.
according to the scriptures or something, and just kind of be agnostic about it. So there's kind of these different positions that people are taking. And even Basil, so Saint Basil early on, I think Zach Huber kind of doesn't buy this narrative, but most patristic scholars have thought that maybe Basil early on, and maybe the other Cappadocians early on, were kind of more homoiousian, like they just have exactly similar essences, but they're not identical or something. So then Eunomius comes along, and he's this guy who's just like, look, let's just call it what it is. These guys have two different, like, they're just not alike at all. They're just totally it's just two different, two different things, two different essences. Like, let's just call it like it is, right? And his argument, Eunomius had a very strong doctrine of divine simplicity. And so basically his argument was, look, we all can agree that the Father is unbegotten, uncaused, archi anarchos. We'll talk about that later. So we all kind of agree to that. And because of like a super duper strong view of divine simplicity, that means that just is the essence of God. God's essence is to be ase, or unbegotten, or uncaused, or whatever.
And I do think that is a similarity he shares with Arius. I think that Arius shows signs of having been very committed to divine simplicity too. And also sort of this like apophatic, above any articulation idea of God. Like like the logos is even inadequate to describe God, because God is beyond category and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that you need to like keep God in this very special, reserved, highest place. And I think perhaps one of Arius's most controversial statements was like, even the logos doesn't fully understand God, but only understand him to the extent that he is able. He has a perfect understanding so far as one is able to understand him, but it must be remembered that God is still above that level of understanding.
Right. Yeah, which and that's one thing. So one sort of caveat I would put there is, so in a way, that's one of the things that Arius would kind of share with the Orthodox, is like, if we're talking about God the Father, we'll all acknowledge is divine, and he's got the divine essence and whatever. And so there's a kind of apophaticism, like, God's essence is mysterious, and so Arius would say, the Logos knows whatever is kind of knowable, but Eunomius actually said he knew. He said, I can tell you what God's essence is. It's being unbegotten. And he even said, I know God's essence better than I know my own essence. Like, I don't know if I could give you a full definition of what human nature is, but I can tell you exactly what God is. And so that was something a lot of people were just like,
so he was really in favor of divine simplicity, but wasn't apophatic like that. He was strangely,
he was
cataphatic, I guess.
I mean, he just thought, look, it's what today we would call aseity. He just was like, look, we know God's unbegotten and absolutely simple, so that's his essence, being unbegotten. Bam, done. So whereas the Cappadocians kind of kept to this traditional view that, well, God's nature is beyond our knowledge, but the Logos, being of the same nature, has a perfect understanding of it. But so the issue with Eunomius was he was so extreme in these ways. So, and also even Arians like Arius and kind of classical Arians would still baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I assume with like triple immersion and everything. Eunomius changed the ritual for baptism to, I think, just a single immersion, and it's in the name of the uncaused monad, or so I don't know.
Just in the name of the Father, not even in the name of Jesus.
I'm not sure if it was the name of the Father even, or what, because that was another thing, is that he didn't tend to use the word Father. He would kind of, and that was something that the Cappadocians were really kind of hammer home. They'd say, look, the name that has been revealed, Jesus says he revealed that God's name. He says, I've revealed your name to the disciples, right? So the name God had already been revealed. The name Yahweh had already been revealed. So what's the name? What is the name of God that Jesus revealed? And it's Father, right? He's always calling God Father. And that's how we're taught to pray, right? Our Father who art in heaven. And the Cappadocians and Eunomius would both agree that God doesn't change. And so there's kind of this, essentially the Cappadocians would argue like that's God's hypostatic property, right? So it defines God as an individual is Father. And so the Cappadocians argue, well, then there can never be a time when God was not a father, which is actually what Arius was condemned for. That's something I've mentioned way back in all those videos and stuff, that, if you read the deposition of Arius, we think of Arianism kind of mostly as this Christological sort of heresy. Like he's remembered for saying there was a time when the Son was not, when the Son didn't exist. But the funny thing is, if you read the deposition, when they list out his heresies, that's in there. But the first thing that they mention is, according to Arius, there was a time when God was not a father. And that's the big heresy. That's the number one spot,
And Origen makes a similar argument to that, even in the 200s, that God must always be a father.
Yeah. And the Cappadocians, so just to give a little more of the history, so Origen had issues. So he eventually had to leave Alexandria, and he went to Palestine for a while. So there was a man named Gregory Thaumaturgos, which means wonder worker or miracle worker. He was a disciple of Origen's. Origen, obviously not considered a saint, but Gregory Thaumaturgos was a saint, and he was a miracle worker, direct disciple of Origen. And Gregory Thaumaturgos is who the Basil and his whole family, lots of people in Cappadocia sort of were converted by him and kind of considered him as this kind of spiritual leader. And not, that. So anyway, the Cappadocians were kind of directly connected to Gregory Thaumaturgos.
And although Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great wouldn't have overlapped with him in time span, but maybe their parents or grandparents,
I think,
had been evangelized by him.
Their family was probably converted by him, and so they kind of remembered him. I don't think, I'd have to look at the timeline, but they might not have been alive at the same time, but they would have, their parents or whatever would have been. Gregory Nazianzus' father actually was some kind of heretic, Hypsistian for a while. They were the Hypsistos is like the most high. So there are these people, we don't know a lot about them. They were most highists. That's who they worshipped. But he eventually became part of the Catholic Church. So, actually, so Basil and Gregory of Nyssa, their whole family, I think just about everybody in their family are saints. So I
think 7 out of 10 of the children of are sainted, which has to be some sort of record, I believe. I'm not sure if any other set of parents has had 7 saints.
So good parenting job. I guess. Learn something from them. But what I was going to say, yeah, you have all these different factions kind of in the middle of the 4th century. As long as Constantine was alive, nobody was going to reject the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed because that was kind of his little project,
Or
But
fight
basically,
too much. There wasn't really much fighting during Constantine's life. He
yeah,
seems to
yeah,
have kept a lid on that. But
yeah.
then
I mean, like
basically as
no
soon
one,
as he dies, it's sort of the
yeah,
the conflict breaks out in a
yeah,
new level of animosity and even violence.
yeah. And part of that, so not Eunomius, Eusebius of Nicomedia was um, one of the few bishops at the first ecumenical council that kind of favored Arius, and I think eventually, I think he signed off
He
on the
signed to the
creed,
creed,
but
but he
wouldn't.
admitted to Constantine that he signed it basically just out of fear of Constantine,
Yeah, yeah,
perhaps even with his
I think,
fingers crossed behind his back or
yeah,
something.
yeah. And
But
but I think he didn't sign off on the anathema uh,
is that,
to Arius. There, I
yeah.
think so. Anyway, but I mean, basically, long story short, he was basically an Arian, but still kind of kept his.
If anything, Arius himself wasn't. I really don't get the impression that Arius himself was super influential. He was consequential,
Yeah, no, he
but
was
not
kind of
like
a
he wasn't
spark
some
that lit off
famous
this. Yeah,
teacher that had this huge audience or something like that, and tons of people following him around. If anything, there was already sort of a cadre of people who agreed with him, who were more influential with him, especially the two Eusebiuses, and that they were more the leaders of the movement, and
yeah,
he was just sort of caught in the crossfire at a very pivotal time or something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, no, basically he started a controversy in Alexandria kind of as a preacher. His bishop told him, "Stop preaching this stuff. You're scandalizing people and whatever." And he was like, "No, I'm going to still preach the same stuff."
Mhm.
And then eventually,
He flees to Caesarea, to Eusebius of
yeah.
Caesarea,
Yeah, that's the
for
thing. Yeah,
his
eventually
protection.
there's a
Yeah.
synod in Alexandria and everybody votes against him, deposes him. So then he goes to Caesarea in Palestine or whatever. And he had people there that were more sympathetic to him. And that's what caused the ecumenical council, because you kind of have you had, canons that deal with things sort of on local levels and within a given patriarchate, but uh, it's like if you leave Africa and go to Asia, I mean, Middle East, right? So, like, how do you settle that? How do you resolve
Right.
this?
There was
This
a jurisdiction question and an
Yeah,
authority question mixed up with a doctrinal question. And Alexandria at the time had like 5 or 6 major factions of the church that were all arguing with each other. Sometimes it was over doctrine, sometimes it was over letting lapsed people who lapsed
yeah,
under persecution back in, or just who should have been the proper successor back in like 260, or like
yeah.
they had all of these factional fights. And so there was a big kind of
Hmm.
need to kind of consolidate the Alexandrian church
Yeah,
at the time. And if we can trust Eusebius of Caesarea's description of Arius's theology, because Eusebius writes a letter back to Alexander and Alexandria in like 323 or something like that, before the council, and he says something like, Arius says that yes, there was a time when the Father did not exist, but yet all time came through him. And so it's only like in this certain kind of, there's like
you mean from the summit?
uncreated time or and created time or something like that. And like all created time comes to be through the Son, but it's only like in this like uncreated time, which I don't really even know exactly what that would even mean or be, that the
Yeah,
Father precedes the Son. And so like how actually different is it to say that the Son is eternally generated from the Father, or that the Son is generated from the Father, but in a time that's outside of our time? It's like,
yeah, yeah.
that's starting to slice a hair pretty thinly, I feel like.
To some extent, I agree with that. I think that people today greatly exaggerate the differences between the Orthodox and Arian view, and partly there's always a tendency, like if there's a schism or something. I mean, each side does want to kind of exaggerate the or emphasize these differences to kind of define an identity for them versus the other person or whatever. And I think historically that's kind of what we've done, and we've just kind of kept this narrative up. I mean, I wouldn't say like the differences are unimportant or
Right.
something like that, but I do think that it's it's problematic, and I think ironically I think it actually sort of does a disservice to Trinitarians today. They do themselves a disservice by exaggerating the differences, because people will go back and be like, well, talk about there's this big controversy, and people didn't always believe in the doctrine of the Trinity, or the pre-Nicene fathers weren't Trinitarian or something like that. And by exaggerating the differences, it's like it makes it sound like oh, people were just all over the map, and I think, well, people weren't.
The Overton window was in some ways tighter than you think, but not often what exactly people think now. Because right now, I mean, being an Arian just means believing Jesus isn't God. Is like that's what most people think when they hear Arian, and I get that label slapped on me a fair amount from people all out there.
You're nowhere near Arians,
right?
Like, I mean, Arians. That's the thing, is Arians are way closer to Trinitarians than they would be to like Unitarians or Muslims or something like that. So it's again, I mean, not to like downplay the differences, but it's not like, well, it was this big mess, and then like the Dan Brown sort of thing, like and they just sort of voted Jesus to be God or something. It's like, well, it was really closer. It was tighter kind of thing.
Right. And no one accuses Arius of not believing in the divinity of Christ per se. It's that like isn't really
the weird thing. This is what's so weird, because Eunomius is such an I mean, he's just like, look, it's not that they have the same essence or an exactly similar essence, or that they're similar. They're just not. They're just different. They're not similar at all. I mean, actually, he would just say they're not similar at all. I mean, there's the created and the uncreated, and there. I mean, well, I don't know. Maybe, I guess he wouldn't want to say they're not, but they don't share any actual properties, right? But then at one point he says, look, nothing that I've said in any way takes away from the divinity of Christ.
Right.
And it's kind of like, well, I mean, it's, but
in his own mind, he still has a view of the divinity of Christ.
Yeah. I mean, he is very
important to him.
Yeah, Jesus is divine. It's just, it's a different divinity. It's a different kind of, a different nature. But I mean, of course, in antiquity, people were more comfortable with the idea that divinity, there's different kinds of divinity, and it kind of comes in degrees and things like that. Like, we kind of tend to just think there's some one single very rigid thing that's the divine nature, and then there's everything else. And and in that day and age, people were more okay with this sort of fluid idea of that, and
scaled, varying degrees of closeness to God. And that if you're getting pretty close to God, then you can be called God or divine in some sort of lesser secondary sense. And I think one thing that's interesting when you sort of look at the Anti-Nicene Fathers and compare it to this argument later is that I'm sure that Eunomius and probably Arius too would not have liked the analogies that a lot of the Anti-Nicene Fathers give of sort of like light from a source of sun or stream from like a fountain or something like that, where oftentimes the Anti-Nicene Fathers would describe Jesus's divinity as somehow flowing out of God's own divinity, such that there was some kind of like they often would use physical metaphors of something coming out of something else and sharing some amount of the properties and even kind of source and substance of what they came out of. So even Tertullian, who will be perfectly clear that there was a time when God wasn't the Father, he still thinks that the Son kind of like oozed. That's not maybe quite the right word,
but
like
that's exactly no, that's exactly right. I think I'm going to be interviewed by someone talking about this in a little bit, but yeah, I mean, that's a fairly common view. It's there in Tertullian and others that, like, I mean, Tertullian is a little bit wonky because he literally believes that God is a like body,
a physical
right?
substance
Yeah,
or
so he's
something. Yeah.
a ginormous ball of gas or something, right? Because Stoics sort of said anything that exists, has in some sense has a body. And he was kind of influenced by that. So he really is thinking, like, think of God the Father as like a ginormous ball of gas, and the Son
Or
is like,
fire or something,
or
like
fire,
a
yeah, or
particle so
Plato.
fine that it
Yeah,
interpenetrates like the whole material universe,
yeah,
but it's like this divine particle or something like that.
right, yeah. I mean, really, he would say, right, the physical stuff that God is it's super tiny little
So it
particles
can
or
go in
whatever.
between all the other atoms or something like that.
Yeah, so he can kind of permeate the whole universe, but he does sort of think, I mean, it's like God the Father is like this big thing, and the Son is like a little smaller chunk sort of inside of him. And you see that in a number of pre-Nicene church fathers. And so, and they'll have this kind of like pregnancy metaphor, right? So it's kind of like the father is like a big mind, and the logos is an idea inside. And it's kind of like the father is pregnant with the logos. I mean, think about it. We use pregnancy metaphors for thought too, right? We talk about conceiving of something. I have a conception of this.
And
And then
Socrates would describe himself as a midwife who helped people
actually,
get
yeah,
their
that's a good
thoughts
point.
out of
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. And yeah, so then the idea is kind of that at some point, a typical pre-Nicene view, and I do think Irenaeus is an exception to this, who's kind of weirdly orthodox, but a more common view would be to kind of connect the begetting of the Son with creation, right? So it's kind of like God has this idea in his mind, and he speaks, like when he says, "Let there be light," he speaks the world into existence. So he's giving birth to the logos. He's got this internal logos and speaks it out, and that is the creation. So it's kind of like this
Right.
happens at the same time.
Or sometimes they would say the internal thing is wisdom and then the external
Yeah,
thing is logos or something like that. And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
like a
Sometimes
it's like a reproduction, an externalized reproduction of the
yeah,
internal mind of God or
yeah,
something like
yeah.
that.
And there's some differences there too. So whether you take the internal and external logos to be the same thing, sort of begotten, or if you think that it's just one represents the other, sort of, or there's
Yeah.
disagreements about that.
Although
But
you wouldn't want God to have been emptied of his logos, because then he
yeah,
would
that's
be mindless.
sort of
They're careful to avoid that implication. That is, if
yeah,
God suddenly is now empty-headed or something.
yeah, and that's one issue. There's a number of issues with that where there's just problems with that view, right? Like that was a pretty commonly discussed sort of model, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the one biggest problem to me just being God is not actually a ginormous ball of gas or fire or whatever, right? I mean, that's just
Wait,
and
what?
eventually, and Origin especially is just like he's more into divine simplicity, and he's like, look, this just God's not material or physical or bodily or anything, and there's no like parts. You can't take a chunk out of God because he doesn't have parts. So
Hmm.
basically what happens is something's got to give on that model, right? And kind of depending on what parts of it you want to preserve and what parts you're willing to give up on, you're going to more or less go in an orthodox or some kind of Arian direction,
Hmm.
right? So like if you want the begetting, like on that pre-Nicene view, the begetting is a process that happens at some point in time, right? And that's connected with creation. But if you can't have the logos kind of starting here and like moving, right, then if you still want there to be a process, like he's going to end up outside, then he just has to come into being ex nihilo.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just what.
But because this idea that God shouldn't change, like that two-stage
Right. Yeah.
logos
God
thing,
should change.
seemingly suggesting a change in God's status, and then the idea that God shouldn't change. So either you have to make the generation of the logos eternal, or you have to say that it's not really coming out of God and that God stayed the same. And then you get sort of creation ex nihilo ideas, which I do think that's actually one of Arius's most unique contributions, as far as I can tell. Like some people like to say,
his unique contribution is to say that Jesus was created ex nihilo.
yes, I think that is actually probably one of the most
for you. That's a unique and valuable contribution.
Well, actually, I mean, I like I already said, like has been said, I don't really agree with Arius, but there are some people who want to be like, look, Arius was just a conservative. He never really made anything up. He was just defending what he'd been taught, and then it was really Alexander who was the innovator, and Arius sort of being a staunch defender. And like David Bentley Hart will say that, Rowan Williams seems to defend that view. But I do think that there was some couple things about Arius that were really pretty unique. And I actually think that the move to say that the Son was created ex nihilo and did not have this sort of substantial connection to his source is perhaps, as far as I can tell, unique to Arius.
No, yeah, I think that's right. I disagree with the view that Arius was more traditional. I think, I mean, that's my narrative. I just think the pre-Nicene, this again, with kind of the exception of Irenaeus, like this kind of fairly common pre-Nicene view with some different variants. I think that just kind of collapsed at some point. People were like, this thing doesn't work. And you just kind of have to go in some direction. And I think that what you see in the 4th century with these different factions, they're just different ways. It's just different ways that you can kind of resolve this problem, right? Like you can give up on one element of it, or you can give up on a different element of it. And I think that's why you get these. And I think that really, and this happens a lot, in philosophy. And maybe that's why I kind of view it that way, is that you have sets of propositions that all seem like common sense. And so everyone kind of wants to affirm all of them. And then someone comes along and points out, well, actually they're contradictory. You take them all these things together, you've got a contradiction on your hands, and you've got to give up one of these things. It's just kind of a question, well, which one of these apparently plausible things that you used to believe are you going to give up on? And you can go, if there's 4 or 5 different propositions, like, well, you're going to get 4 or 5 different views, right? Depending on which one you give up on.
Yeah. Interesting.
And it really just comes down to like, just you have to sort of look at these things and prioritize, well, which one of these is really the most important to me and which of these is less. And so you have, there's a question like, is it important to me that the Father and Son are the same kind of thing? Is it important to me that the Son has always existed? Or is it important to me that begetting and creating kind of are things that happen together? I mean, so it's just kind of what part of that model do you want to preserve and what parts are you willing to give up?
Yeah, I still think an interesting, like, of the people who had the most unique combination, I think, of trying to solve those questions was Marcellus of Ancyra. And you talked about how I'm like really different from the Trinitarians and the Arians, but Marcellus of Ancyra is sort of like the example that makes it seem like, well, maybe not as different as you might think. Because I think that he is, I mean, I think he was basically a biblical Unitarian, but tried to hide it. And his main disciple, Photinus, just stopped trying to hide it. But Marcellus and Athanasius were strangely strong allies for like the 330s or something.
Yeah, it's weird.
And I think the main thing that unites them is the idea that the Logos is eternal and that the Logos is like fully representative of God. And that's like a strange thing that a biblical Unitarian and a Athanasian could agree on. And if that is the most important dividing line in the battle,
like God's internal Logos, that's
right. Yeah. and so but Marcellus was at the Council of Nicaea and apparently signed on to it. We don't have any record that he didn't, even though I don't know how, reading his theology, he could have signed it in good faith, if I'm honest. But his main thing was, look, the Logos is eternal, the Logos is totally God, the Logos is one substance with God, all of that stuff. But the Logos isn't the Son of God. We should use the Son of God only for the human being Jesus, and we shouldn't use the phrase Son of God until we're talking about that born of Mary.
Yeah.
And then at that point, you got a human being who gets
the Logos is homoousios with the Father and all that. But yeah, it's the fact that in the Creed it's one Lord Jesus Christ. Well, he'd be okay with calling Jesus Christ the Son of God. But it's sort of bridging the gap between Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and this Logos thing over here that is homoousios with the Father, and they're not really identical. There's just kind of a
right. Yeah. And he kind of seems his incarnation
kind of Nestorius.
Yeah, I think, and he might be sort of Nestorian. It's a little bit unclear to me how he exactly gets the Logos to be Jesus, or how exactly, if that's some sort of transformation. But as long as you just say it's a power of God, because he doesn't want multiple people up there in the Godhead. He's extremely clear about that. So the Logos isn't its own person. It's just sort of a power or a function of God. And if that's at work in a human person, then you're a biblical Unitarian. And so that was so I do think that there was a strange time where the Athanasians and the biblical Unitarians had enough common ground against the Arians to view each other as useful allies for a little bit.
Yeah, and that's one thing that is, I mean, I tend to, I guess, stay away from these like discussions about the politics of it, because I think that people, especially in theology, it's like that's all they want to talk about, to the exclusion of like
the ideas themselves,
the actual ideas. So I kind of, but it is true. Like you have, I mean, part of what's going on in the 4th century is you have just like people who don't have exactly the same views, but like it's kind of like, well, but at least you're better than this guy, maybe we can kind of, and that is what I meant by saying that I think Eunomius in some way is responsible for the triumph of Trinitarianism, because you really have these kind of disagreeing factions and everything, but Eunomius seemed like so extreme and so crazy that anyone, like a lot of people sort of got together and they were just like, well, look, let's put our differences aside and just agree to something, and just at least let's.
Sometimes a lot of there are a lot of examples of that in church history and outside of church history, where sometimes the best way to resolve a disagreement is to scapegoat someone that almost everyone can disagree with, should be on the outside, and then form an alliance of exclusion around the obvious bad example.
And part of what, to kind of bring it back to the Cappadocians, part of what St. Basil in particular did, Athanasius did some of this kind of later on, kind of peacemaking between disagreeing factions and things, but Basil in particular, and then Gregory Nazianzus kind of helped some, and Gregory of Nyssa in this, but maybe more so Basil was kind of the politician who sort of got like different factions and said, look, you know, we've got these people who are really big on the Council of Nicaea, and in some sense, everyone, I think people would kind of like to sign off on the Council of Nicaea, because it seems like that was this authoritative thing or whatever, if they felt like they could. And Basil sort of persuaded people that like, hey, what you're saying really properly understood is homoousios. Like you can affirm this term, and it, you know, properly understood, it really means the same thing. We're not really disagreeing, or you know, we're not. Anyway, we can agree on the term, right? And we can all sort of be on board with this. So he kind of did a lot to bring people together. And again, at this time when it's like, well, Eunomius is so nuts, like let's get together on something if we can, right?
Right. And if Eunomius is what it would really look like to not use the word homoousian, then maybe you can feel more comfortable using it. So yeah, let's focus on what is we've been circling around doing a lot of history stuff. What exactly is sort of Gregory of Nyssa and the Cappadocian view of the Trinity that comes to be sort of the standard definition?
Yeah, so they're the ones that really define these terms hypostasis and ousia, which are not in the creed. Ousia, homoousius is, but they start using these terms, which prior to that, people kind of used in different ways in different contexts. So, and probably there's a epistle. It's listed as Epistle 38 in Saint Basil's epistles, but most scholars today think it was probably written. It's probably Gregory of Nyssa, because it's also in a collection of Gregory of Nyssa's letters to his brother Peter. But either way, so basically in this epistle, he defines those terms, and I guess I'll say, maybe I'll go into this a little bit, but because sometimes people act like, oh, it's so, what do these words mean? It's so puzzling or whatever. And I want to push back on that, because the reality is the way he defines it in this letter, and it does become kind of the canonical, like this is the definition that the church uses. He really just steals all of this stuff from like textbooks that were widely read and available at the time, and it would have been obvious to anyone who was reading his letter. So the first thing that he does to distinguish between ousia and hypostasis is he references some grammarians, so Greek grammar textbooks, basically, that are talking about the difference between common nouns and proper nouns. And he just says, common nouns, the view in antiquity, starting with the Stoics, and then weirdly moving on into the grammarians, took all their stuff over from the Stoics, and they tried to kind of get rid of all the metaphysics and other stuff and just kind of focus on grammar. But they actually did, even in grammar textbooks, weirdly, they still sort of took on board a little bit of Stoic metaphysics. So the idea was that a common noun expresses a common quality, and a proper noun expresses a particular property. So like cow, horse, those would be common nouns, and those express this common property. And basically Gregory says that's what we're talking about when we use the word ousia. It's this common, generic, kind property. And then words like Socrates or Peter and Paul express the Stoics thought that everyone had this unique property that like uniquely identifies you, and that's what a proper noun expresses. And Gregory says that's what we mean by hypostasis. He kind of, the word hypostasis gets used a little bit differently in different contexts. So sometimes it just means like Peter or Paul that's the hypostasis. Sometimes it's used to mean like their hypostatic property, whatever the unique property is that they have. And then he defines hypostasis a little bit more explicitly, and there he just steals a definition from Porphyry, who wrote a kind of famous introduction to Aristotle's categories, and where Porphyry defines an individual in the category of substance, so an individual thing, as kind of a bundle of properties that give you like a unique property, is what we would call a hypostatic property, or they called an idioma.
So in some sense, he's being a little bit innovative in the Christian tradition, but in another sense, he's gathering definitions and philosophical articulations that would have been around. If not, maybe they weren't the universally agreed upon definition of these words, but they were previously used versions of these.
Yeah, they're not new. They're not just brand new concepts that he just pulled out of the air or made up. There's a little bit that I think Gregory of Nyssa did that maybe was really original, but and sometimes people fault the church fathers, especially John of Damascus. People, they like, oh, they just copied and pasted stuff. But a lot of people today, the scholarship is, I think, rightly moving away from that and thinking, well, in some sense, I mean, they're copying and pasting definitions and things that were around, but they're putting them together in thoughtful ways, intentionally. So, but so anyway, you get the ousia, the nature is kind of this common property that is what things of a natural kind sort of share in common, and then the hypostatic property is this particular property, or can be a set of properties. There's a little ambiguity about that. And so he just says, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are three hypostases, but there's one ousia, there's one nature. I think an important question is, so people, there's this analogy that Gregory makes, and in Ad Ablabium, this letter he wrote to another bishop, Ablabius, about why there's not three gods, or why we don't say three gods. There's this analogy people make to three men. So, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, or Silvanus and Timothy, or whatever. And Gregory will just be like, yeah, that's a fine analogy, right? So that's kind of what a lot of social Trinitarians pick up on, is like, well, he's willing to kind of run with this analogy of three men. But of course, he then goes through and qualifies and says, well, here's how it's a good analogy. Here's the ways in which it's kind of different. And here's, how things sort of work. But now I lost my train of thought. What was it? So he accepts that.
He's fine saying, these are three hypotheses,
three hypotheses
of aluminum.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say the question really, I think people should be asking more is, so I mean, all the church fathers are going to say, yeah, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have the same essence. It's the exact same nature, ousia, whatever. The question that you need to ask is, do three men have the same ousia, and in what sense? So ultimately, so I'm of the view, I think people get kind of confused on this. Even scholars, I think, get confused on this. Homoousios, the word homoousios itself really gets defined generically. So, I mean, Gregory of Nyssa is explicit about this. John of Damascus is explicit. I mean, everyone's just, three men are homoousios. So you and me, I mean, even in the Council of Chalcedon, right? This is something else that people, I think, don't pay enough attention to, is at Chalcedon, Christ is homoousios with the Father according to his divine nature, and he's homoousios with us according to the human nature. So when people sometimes want to pack a whole lot into the definition of homoousios, that might be true about the Trinity. Like it's true that the Trinity are more closely united than three men, right? But it's not just part of the definition of homoousios. Like homoousios itself.
Homoousios is a relatively broad term that can be used to apply to the three persons of the Trinity, even though there might be more to say about their unity than just the word homoousios.
Right, exactly. So, and my take on it is it's really the word undivided. So, we'd say the Trinity are homoousios and not divided. Gregory has I think he has kind of a weird, not weird, but anyway, different view, kind of idiosyncratic view, that he thinks that natures are not divided even among men, right? So he would say you and I, so he kind of has a view about, like, he's a hardcore realist about universals, right? Like you and I have literally the same nature, substance, essence, right? Whereas a lot of other people, church fathers, think of it as like, well, there's your human nature over there, and there's my human nature over here, or my little instance of human nature and yours, and they're both exactly similar, right? They're sort
Mhm.
of the same generic kind, but there's a division, and so they are numerically two.
Right. There's nothing that you and I would share besides being in the same category. But
Yeah,
but
it's
Gregory of
really,
Nyssa maybe wants to go beyond that and be like, there's something substantially real about the nature that you and I share, something more than just being in the same category.
yeah, it's really, I think, a difference between what today we would call trope theory, versus, so tropes versus universals, as we think of them today. So the in metaphysics, we talk about, like, is my humanity identical? Is it my humanity equals your humanity? So it's the same property, but it's in two places at the same time, which is kind of strange, but that's the view. Or is it like, well, you have a little instance of this property and I have an instance of this property. You have a trope of humanity and I have a trope of humanity. I don't know why people started using the word trope, but anyway. And those are not identical. They're qualitatively identical, but they're numerically distinct.
Right. Right.
And most people, I think, take that view that they're numerically distinct tropes or instances of the same property.
And their
then they would
trope
just
would
say,
be
but
trope becomes pretty similar to the word hypothesis in that view.
well, it's so a hypothesis would be like, you would be a hypothesis, and
So
I'm
I am so the thing that has a trope is the
right.
hypothesis. Yeah. All right. Okay.
Um, so if you have that kind of trope theory, you'd say, well, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are homoousios, and also, importantly, you'd want to add undivided, so they have the same trope of
Mm-hmm.
divinity, right? Rather than, so that's in that view, that's kind of what, that's why you don't get three gods, where you get three humans or three men, is because that trope of divinity is not separated or divided, right?
Yeah.
For Gregory of Nyssa, he just thinks that it's the same property over there and over here, and so that's why he says, well, strictly speaking, there's only one man too.
Mm-hmm.
We just kind of, by an abuse of language, say three men because it's kind of convenient, and we need to be able to, do keep receipts and things like this. So, so we, and people have criticized him for that. Like, they think they've looked at his argument and thought, well, he just, he needs to defend the doctrine of the Trinity, and he's just kind of been backed into a corner. He's accepted this three-man analogy, and so he's just like, all right, I'll just kind of say there's only one
I'll
man.
bite the bullet and say that.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, he's just biting the bullet, and I don't think that he's biting the bullet. I think he just, he has, that's his view about universals, and on that view, you would say, well, yeah, so strictly speaking, there's just one man that's kind of popping up in different places, but it's not convenient to count like that. So just as a practical matter, I mean, maybe that's not, maybe that's not true, but anyway, I don't think he's just biting the bullet. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's kind of his considered view. But I also would say, I mean, I don't think that all church fathers think of universals in that way. I think most, like, I think Gregory Nazianzen, he addresses this, and what he says is, well, yeah, there are three men because the nature is divided. So you've got three manhoods, so you have three men. But with the Trinity, it's not divided. But I think a lot of people in the West, that's been the view typically, is that it's this kind of trope theory view, and the persons of the Trinity are not divided. And a lot of people have wanted to think that the word homoousios or consubstantial kind of carries with it this idea of being undivided. And then they can't figure out, well, why do these guys accept the three-man analogy? Why do they say things elsewhere that, or how can Christ be homoousios with us? And
Yeah.
you get people like William Lane Craig, who just wants to interpret homoousios as meaning like, there's one concrete thing with three minds, right?
I'm glad you brought him up. So a question that I have for
Yeah.
you So William Lane Craig, in his model of the Trinity in this Four Views book, I will say he's a little bit more vague about his view than he has
I'll
been
say.
in other places. But one of the things that he still wants to say, seemingly, is that the three persons are really, psychological persons, I guess, as we
Yeah.
would say it, that they have a unique first
Yeah.
person perspective, a mind in some sense, and like a will, and like a psychological definition of a person, therefore connecting that with hypothesis, and that there are three of these things sharing one soul. And one question I had for you is, would Gregory of Nyssa have felt that the three persons of the Trinity had their own unique, selfhood or psychological perspective hood, or however you want to define it? Or is that really not what they had in mind or had in view?
No, I think it's not at all. I recently was reminded of this quote from Michelle Renee Barnes, who I regard as probably the most important scholar in this field alive, and for the last several decades, if not more. Anyway,
Michelle Renee Barnes.
Barnes, yeah. I mean, I think everyone would put him up. I mean, if you don't think he's the most important, I mean, he's at least up there with Lewis Ayres and John Baer and these guys. But anyway, there was a quote. He said this at one point in an article. He just said,
No, he lives in Milwaukee. Anyway, sorry, I'm listening.
Yeah. He just said, like, if the word person were to be eliminated from the English language and every other modern language, we would be much better off in our understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity. We just sort of stopped using it. And yeah, because I mean, it doesn't. The concept of hypostasis has almost nothing to do with the modern idea of a person. And people, Hasker brought this up too, and people, social Trinitarians especially, harp on this constantly because they need it to be. I mean, that's kind of they want to have support from the Cappadocians for this view of social Trinitarianism, and
like the love argument for the Trinity is pretty popular right now.
There's other
and stuff like that. And so if you're going to use if God is love, there needs to be at least two, a lover and a beloved, perhaps hopefully a reciprocated lover and beloved. And so you need, to be the sort of thing that could love and be loved. It seems like you need something like a psychological person. And so that argument and its popularity trends towards like our definition of personhood for the three hypostases.
Yeah, there's various reasons why people would want that. They want each person to be, have its own will and center of consciousness and all this stuff. But but yeah, no, I don't think you get that at all. So for one thing, the Cappadocians would say there's only one will. I mean, that's part of their response to the criticism. This is tritheism. You've got three different gods or whatever. And they'd say, well, no, there's only one will. There's only one power. There's only one activity. So no, it's not like, Greek polytheism where you got Zeus and Poseidon and Hades. They might get into a war with each other because they each have their own will and whatever. Like, that's impossible. That's part of the argument, part of Scott Williams' argument against social Trinitarianism, is this necessary agreement issue. Like, once you say there's three wills, you just have to have some kind of further story about why they don't disagree, why they can't disagree. And it's always kind of either by fiat or, like some kind
by
of
happy coincidence.
Yeah, it's either quit or convoluted, like, well, here's because they're omnibenevolent, they'd always try to agree or something. But I think there's always counterexamples to these
or
things.
They'd always have to agree because the good is always the same. And so if they all love the same good thing, I mean, they'd always want the same thing.
Yeah, one way they try to do it, like Richard Swinburne tries to do this, like, they all are omnibenevolent, so they'll always kind of choose the good. But then what about like the Holy Spirit wants the grass to be blue, but the Father wants it to be green, and the Son wants it to be red? Or there's no moral issue there, right? Or like,
So
I
you
want
think, I don't know, you're in Kentucky. I thought that you would have strong feelings about the proper color of grass.
Right, true. But I mean, there's contingent issues, like which, is the universe, is the galaxy going to spin clockwise or counterclockwise? Or, I mean, there are contingent things that don't seem to have any moral issue, right? And then it's like, well, okay, but they wouldn't, get into a fight because of being omnibenevolent. They'd know that it's better to kind of agree on things, and they'd just kind of work it out. But even there's not like, that's not a solution to a decision problem. So you can have what's some people refer to as a Canadian standoff. So like,
everyone comes to a stop sign at the same time. And
right. Yeah, everyone. Yeah, and it's like, you go first. No, you go first, right? Or you come to a door and it's like, oh, here you. No, after you. Oh no, after you.
Yeah.
And even benevolent, if you're benevolent or omnibenevolent, there's no automatic decision solution to a Canadian standoff. Like, so I mean, it could be like the Holy Spirit's like, well, let's do what the Father wants this time around. The Father's like, well, no, as the Son, we did different. Let's have him do one. No, the Son's like, let's have the Holy Spirit. And there's not necessarily going to be a solution to that issue. So I just find these things, and I just don't think there is a solution to the necessary agreement issue, right? I mean, you have to have you want to say this wouldn't happen in any possible world, and I don't think there's a good solution to that. But in any case, I certainly can say the Cappadocians don't think that. I mean, there's only one will, and Gregory of Nyssa even, and I reference a paper from Derek King in my chapter that he points this out, that there's a passage in Contra Eunomius where Gregory just says, any thought that is present to the Father is immediately present to the Son, and vice versa. Like, they can't have, like he even talks about, I mean, Gregory denies that there can be speech, literally speaking, like there can't be like communication between the persons of the Trinity in a non-metaphorical sort of way, because there's no separation.
There's not that big enough of a difference or separation between them.
Yeah, they're not separate. So it's just anything that's present to the Father's consciousness is to the Son's consciousness, and so forth.
So what makes them different then? I feel like that's cutting to that gets rid of some of the problems. But then you start to say, okay, so really, how are these separate? What exactly is a hypostasis then? What makes the Son at all really distinct from the Father? If they have the same will, they have the same activity. Like what is it then?
The answer is one is unbegotten and the other is begotten.
Okay, so what is the one then that is begotten and unbegotten, right?
The Father is unbegotten, the Son is begotten.
Yeah, but what makes them distinct to even say that one is begotten and one's unbegotten? Because what?
Begetting, right?
Begetting. So but then what is the thing that is begotten? Like what kind of sort of thing is it?
So I think what you're getting at. So William Lane Craig made this objection. I mean, he says, well, basically, this is really just one person. It's basically, it's like a form of Unitarianism, really, or he called Unitarianism, but really modalism is, I guess, what he really thinks. So let me say something about that, because here's one of the things that comes up in the book. In reality, if you look at the argument that I gave, it's not really super central to the whole thing. But Craig sort of bangs on about like how counting is by identity. We count, that's how counting works, and this is like a relative identity view or something, because no one in antiquity thought that you count things by whether they're identical, like it's just two names for the same thing. They thought you count things depending on whether they're divided. They're in some
Although
sense.
didn't Craig kind of recently say that they didn't have the concept of identity in antiquity?
Well, that's the thing. So there's two ways in which Craig sort of contradicted himself in that. So to me, he insists like, no, counting works by identity. There's absolutely no other possibility. That's the only, there's not even another conceptual possibility. It's just nuts. You're crazy. Go read Chris Hughes and blah, blah, blah. And then to Dale, he said, hey, you're asking this question about numerical identity. People in the ancient world didn't even have the concept of numerical identity. And
so
I
then they
actually
couldn't
asked,
count it back then either.
yes,
It's by implication. Yeah.
that's the implication. And I actually, at this round table at EPS, the Evangelical Philosophical Society last year now, I had the chance to sit down with him, and so we could ask each other, questions and I asked him this. I was like, so to me, you said counting works by identity. There's no other possible way. And then to Dale, you said people didn't even have the concept of identity. And he sort of just filibustered for a while. I think maybe didn't get what I was asking. And I finally kind of was like, but so how would they count if they lacked the concept? That's the only possible concept by which someone could ever engage in counting, and they didn't have it. How did ancient people count? And all he had to say was just like, oh yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
I mean, even though that was almost central to his defense against some of Dale Tuggy's points.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that was a big part of his response to Dale. Yeah, was this is this question that people in the New Testament would do. They didn't even have the concept of identity. They wouldn't even ask this question.
Specifically, his kind of response to John 17:3, I think, was basically
yeah. Well, a lot of Dale's argument is kind of, it's what I call the who is God problem. It's just if we're referring to an individual, a hypothesis, as God, who does that refer to? And it almost always refers to the Father in the New Testament. So that's kind of a big, central argument of his. So it has to do with identity. And yeah, Craig's response is like, people didn't even have the concept of identity. So they could have said, the Father is God, the Son is God, and they, transitivity of identity and all that. They didn't have any concept.
Yeah. So how many people were the Messiah in the New Testament? Who knows? Just because they're saying Jesus is the Messiah doesn't mean doesn't rule anyone else.
David was a Messiah. Lots of Messiahs.
Yeah, Pontius Pilate might have been the Messiah. Who knows? Just because Jesus is doesn't exclude anyone else.
But the other way in which Craig, that's not, I guess, strictly a contradiction. It's just kind of this obvious gap in the theory. Like you need to explain this, and it's not clear how you would explain it. But with me, he more or less definitely contradicted himself. So he says we count by identity, and what that means is if X is an F and Y is an F, and X and Y are not the same thing, that's two Fs, right? Just automatically. But then he says to me that the Father and Son and Holy Spirit on this view would really just be one person if they just have a single cognitive faculty, they have a single will and so forth, right? But that is just to say that we don't count by identity, right? We don't count persons by identity. We count them in exactly the way that Gregory of Nyssa says that we count when we're using agent nouns, right? We count the activity. We count the number of token activities, not the number of hypostases that are doing the activity. So he in practice, in actual practice, he's agreeing exactly with Gregory of Nyssa's views about counting. But then he just turns around and says, well, but that's not how we count.
So how are the Word and the Spirit not just like attributes or activities of God the Father?
Well,
in this view,
in some sense they are. That's kind of is a common way of putting it, is that you've got God is like a nous, a mind, right? And he has a logos, an idea, and he has a spirit, his life. And I mean, one way of putting the doctrine of the Trinity is people would say, well, yeah, so God has these two powers, but it's not the same. It doesn't sort of work the same way as it would with us, where it's contingent and they're insubstantial. So, like our logos, my word kind of comes into being out here in the air and then it passes away and it's insubstantial, right? But with God, his logos and his spirit are substantial. They are these kind of concrete things. So they're still in some sense hypostatic. This sounds really weird because to us it usually seems like, well, how could something both be a substance, like it's a thing, but also it's just like an activity? That seems like it doesn't make sense to us. And one thing to keep in mind, so this is kind of arcane, I guess, but like the Neoplatonic metaphysics of light. That sounded really fancy, but in sort of the same way.
And they talked about light quite a bit. The Neoplatonists loved light. That was light was a big deal for them.
Right. Well, and partly because it's kind of a good metaphor for some of this stuff about they had the Neoplatonic sort of triad, but so think about this. I mean, today, right? Like we think in quantum physics, like, well, light is both a wave and a particle, and it just kind of and it's like, well, how? I mean, that doesn't really make any sense, right? A particle is a substantial thing, and a wave of energy is just like motions of things. So it's like, how can the same thing be both a substance and an energy? I mean, right? And even in antiquity, they had this. They were dealing with the same sort of issue, but from a kind of different angle, which is, if you light up on their view, perception works by a form being transmitted through a medium, right? So if you're hearing something, like the sound starts with your voice and it goes through the air starts vibrating, so it takes on the form, like your vocal cords are vibrating. That's a pattern. Yeah. That's a form. The air starts having, denser and rarefied places, and that's a form, right? It's a pattern, and that makes the pattern in your ear, and so on. So the medium is a substance, right? Yeah. And it can take on a form. So the form starts over here, then this medium takes it on.
And there's a transmitting substance that can move a form from source to receiver.
Right. And so, like with touch or smell or hearing, there's the medium there. But if you think about vision, if the room is dark, right, then I can't see anything.
Right.
So the medium can't just be like the air, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that was the view anyway. I mean, this is not scientifically accurate, but anyway, that's the view, right?
It's not far from scientifically accurate.
Yeah, no, it's not maybe too far. But anyway, the point is, you light a torch, right? So now you have light, and now you can see.
Mm-hmm.
So light must be the medium
that can transmit a form.
Transmitting a form. Yeah. So light has to be at least acting as a substance. In some sense, it's a substance because it can take on form, right? But yet it's an energy of the torch.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the torch is illuminating the room. You put out the fire on the torch and the light's gone. The light doesn't have its own, like it can't stay in existence. So in some weird way, it kind of is a substance, but it doesn't actually fit the definition of substance because it doesn't have its own independent existence.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of, in some weird way, it's kind of substantial, but it's an energy too.
Who talks about this sort of stuff a lot is Michael Servetus. Michael Servetus is all about how light is the transmitter of form. And then he has a distinction, and this is wild, between created light and uncreated light. And that the uncreated light is how the forms from, say the realm of forms, right? The kind of Platonic realm of forms, how they sort of get into our intellect and illuminate our mind is through the uncreated light. And the goal is to not just see things as they are with created light, but to transcend into seeing them with uncreated light. And John Calvin seemingly had no idea what he was talking about. But Michael Servetus was very well read in the Neoplatonists and stuff like that. It's fascinating. I'm doing a big study on him. I'm going to try and make a video series on him. He is wild. Anyway, he totally misunderstood, but it's very similar.
Kind of orthodox.
I honestly think that Michael Servetus is closer to orthodox than John Calvin, and that's
probably in some ways, yeah. But that is interesting. I'll have to see that, because you just hear about Michael Servetus, and it's like all you hear is, well, he's the guy who didn't believe in the Trinity, and then Calvin burned him at the stake. It's like, okay. So yeah, that's interesting. He kind of has a
but he spends chapters and chapters talking about how light is the transmitter of form, and it's like, well, you see a Coke can, all right, well, like, you're not like actually, your mind isn't touching the Coke can, your mind is just seeing the light, and then it is able to recognize that it's a Coke can, and so it must be that the light somehow contains a representation of form that your mind is able to apprehend and then recognize that it's Coke can.
That's interesting. I wonder if the issue is just that he was a realist and Calvin was a nominalist.
Part of it. That is certainly part of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating. Well, I'll look forward to your.
And the form of Christ is the form of all forms.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that somehow he has this very
interesting. I guess I'd thought of him as kind of more Unitarian. So is he just kind of like Arian or something?
He is almost category busting. He seems to think that basically the Christ form pre-exists, but it's not, say, animate or personal. It is sort of eternally static but true. And it's sort of like in Christ, in the Christ form's mind is all the other forms, right? It's like the container wrapper of every other.
Well, that's standard.
That's pretty standard. And that somehow the Christ form gets into Mary and is like, creates a human who is the perfect, like, incarnation, I guess is maybe the right word, maybe not exactly the right word, of the Christ form. And that he talks a lot about how the breath of the Holy Spirit is what sort of moves the Christ form from the realm of forms inside Mary. And then that Jesus is the perfect that. But he'll make the Marcellus of I think he's really actually very similar to Marcellus, is that the Son of God should really only refer to that born of Mary. And and that in a certain sense Jesus doesn't pre-exist, but in a certain sense he does, or at least his form did. And that it's this kind of new presentation of the form of all forms in a human being, when previously it was just in the abstract realm.
What did Servetus think about the theophanies in the Old Testament?
He talks a ton about theophanies.
And is that Christ, or is that God the Father?
Yes, it is the Christ form, but it is not Jesus's like personhood or something like that, but it is the form that will then come to be input in Mary as Jesus. But when you're seeing God in the Old Testament, you're seeing the Christ form.
That's interesting. I guess I should read up more on that, because the way you're describing it sounds more like it's maybe like a Christological, like Nestorian or something like that, rather than as so much a Trinitarian. You just hear about it like, well, he wasn't a Trinitarian, but I wonder if it was really more just the Christology of it. That,
and I think that
I don't know. But.
Yeah, I don't think he's Nestorian, because he really does seem to think that the Christ form became,
or like a Apollinarian or something.
But he's very insistent that Jesus's human mind is a human mind and a human soul, and is like, but he's a human that somehow is like the perfect image of God or something like that.
Yeah.
Due to the special creation of the Holy Spirit.
That's wild. I'll have to. Yeah. Now I'll have to.
There is not a lot. There is not a lot written about him, honestly. I think is
there's not. Like I said, all I ever heard is just like, well, this guy wasn't Trinitarian. I just figured he was more like biblical Unitarian or something,
And he kind of is sometimes. I think he probably in the final analysis might classify as a Unitarian, but he's very unique. And it's because, I mean, most Unitarians hate Neoplatonism, but he loves Neoplatonism. He's like, what if you were a Unitarian who just turned Neoplatonism up to 11? So anyway, I still need to, you would find him fascinating, and I think you would find him strangely more agreeable than Calvin.
Probably in some way.
You're probably in some way.
Yeah.
Anyway, we don't need to dwell too much on that. But anyway, you were talking about light and the transmission of. Anyway, I was just
you were
because
saying how do the Son and Holy Spirit not just end up being kind of powers of the Father, but yeah, I mean that is one way that some people put it.
You see, and this is where I feel like
later on, like even John of Damascus in certain places will put it that way, and definitely once Islam comes around, a lot of the Arabic language Christian apologetics, people don't read it as much because it's kind of conventionally, for whatever reason, people make John of Damascus be like the last of the church fathers, which I think is kind of artificial. But anyway, so they don't read it as much. But yeah, a lot of the Arabic speaking Christians, that's how they would explain it to Muslims, as they would say, well, it's just God has, that's the title of my chapter, is God and his word and his spirit are one God. And that becomes it's there in John of Damascus, but that becomes a very common thing in Arabic language Christian apologetics being presented to Muslims, is God and his word and his spirit are one God.
And it's weird because that's something
after
that
the fall of Constantinople, that's even Gennadios Scholarios even kind of puts it that way, that we believe in this one God, and then he has a logos and a spirit, and but they're kind of substantial in some way.
And I feel like that's something that, like, a Unitarian, that at least that sentence alone is something that doesn't ruffle the feathers of a Unitarian. And in fact, sometimes we might even say it that way to argue against, I don't know, more social forms of Trinitarianism. Is that often what Unitarians are denying is that there are three cognitive faculty endowed persons.
Well, then you're okay.
Yeah,
that part's okay. What I end up saying in that chapter is that in reality, it seems that Craig actually, in practice, he counts the same things in exactly the same way as Gregory of Nyssa. It's just that what Gregory calls a hypostasis is what Craig calls an ousia, and what Craig calls a divine person is what Gregory calls a God.
Right.
And they count them in the same way. It's just that Gregory thinks there's only one of them, and Craig thinks there's three of them.
So Craig has the three
persons, and Gregory calls them gods, but they count them in the same way, right? They say if you got three cognitive faculties, then you've got three of these things. If you've got one cognitive faculty, you've got one of those things.
Yeah. So what? Maybe you can help me understand, what exactly does Craig mean by a soul when he's talking about the three persons?
I have to say, I mean,
and also why, and since when do we ever say that God has a soul? Is
well, I mean, I guess God, maybe he would say God is a soul. No, I mean, it's just, I mean, I don't know. And maybe I don't know how. It's hard to know sometimes, like, how literally he wants to be taken, or is it just kind of like, this is a good analogy, it's a model or whatever. But it was really disappointing. I'll say something good about Craig, because I don't want to just badmouth him, but it's nice about his main chapter. Like, basically what happens is his main chapter is like 90% of it is just going through like kind of current
deity of Christ,
cutting edge scholarship stuff, on the divinity of Christ in the New Testament. And like, it's cool. It's nice to have it. It's William Lane Craig. He's a smart guy. Has a PhD in philosophy and one in theology. And he keeps up with this stuff and knows people who specialize in it. So it's nice to have him come along and give this, like, here, I've read all of this stuff and I'm summarizing it all for you, and here's the state of scholarship right now. So it's nice to have that. It's a valuable thing. And then, like, he's got like 2 pages on his model of the Trinity, like how does the Trinity actually work? So, I mean, for me, I mean, like, for Dale, it's like, okay, cool. Well, I've got a lot to, push back on and work with, whatever. But for me, it's just like, well, okay, so you believe Jesus is divine, and that was like 90% of your whole thing. And it's like, okay, but I want to see, like, what, I mean, I'm not going to be talking about that. I want to talk about your model of the Trinity. And who knows? I mean, he says virtually nothing in his main chapter. So it sort of put me in a position that, like, well, I've got to go through, I've got to just kind of go through other stuff that he's written about the Trinity. And
it's unclear if he's changed his mind or revised his
Oh
position.
yeah, no, he totally has. Because I mean, I wrote a whole chapter, kind of critiquing, here's all the problems I see with his view. And then in his response, it's like, I've got a different view now. I've got to change my so in my final chapter, I'm just kind of like, well, I guess I owe Craig an apology because he said pretty much nothing. So I had to go and read all this other stuff and respond to that. And I don't really think that his response, like, I don't think the way that his view has changed ultimately really solves much of anything. It's just kind of a different mess from the mess that I was thinking it was.
Used to thinking, yeah.
So,
and it seems sort of like I think he's being somewhat ecumenical and sort of doing a lowest common denominator Trinitarianism in that chapter.
Yeah.
And because, like, most evangelical Christians, they really don't care about Trinity stuff.
Oh yeah.
They just want Jesus to be God,
right,
and for that sentence to be really true in some satisfying way. But that's what Craig is
doing in his chapter. Like, the 90% of it is that's the Jesus is divine, and then the model. Well, here's just stuff. The weird thing though about that, I mean, I think I agree with you. Like, he wants to have this very sort of big tent, lowest common denominator sort of Trinitarianism. But the weird thing about it is the way, I mean, like, literally so I have this paper, One God the Father, where I kind of talk about Dale's definitions and my definition of Trinitarian. And literally, I in that paper, I mean, I define what I call a broadly Trinitarian view, just exactly the same way that Craig does. And then I just say, and then monarchical Trinitarianism is, within this big camp, it would say this, as opposed to, social Trinitarianism and relative identity Trinitarianism. So it's just it's just constructed deliberately as like it's one version of that big thing. But then he's, spends all this time criticizing my view, and it's like, I thought you only wanted to defend, this, like, broad view, which monarchical Trinitarianism is one of those views. So it's like, why are you?
But he still has anti-Arian, anti-Unitarian feelings when he reads your view, it seems like.
Yeah, I guess, but then it's like, well, okay, so then you don't just want to defend, like, this broad view of Trinitarianism. Like, you really think that Trinitarianism needs to be,
there's some fine print somewhere that he didn't lay out that he still wants to back up. Yeah.
It's so, anyway.
How'd you feel about your interactions with Hasker in the book?
I mean, Hasker is probably the person that he's definitely the person I'm most sympathetic to, because he's, at least in his book on the Trinity, he spends a lot of time talking about the 4th century church fathers, and he talks some about kind of more recent secondary, like, scholarship on the church fathers in that era. So, he has kind of a more historically oriented approach. And a lot of what he says, I kind of agree with. Also, the weird thing about it, though, I mean, So what monarchical Trinitarianism is, we're an hour and a half in, and I haven't said it, but what it is I mean, it just says basically the Father is the source in some sense of the Son and the Holy Spirit, right? He's the arche and archos, the source without source, right? And the Son and the Spirit are eternally, generated or begotten and spirited. So that's kind of one part of the view, is just that you've got the eternal generation and spiration and stuff, and then the other part of it. So that's the metaphysical part of it, and that's just standard Orthodox Trinitarian. I mean, that's something that you'd see in Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, Luther, Westminster Confession, London, this, what is 1689 London Baptist Confession or whatever. I mean, all it's just a standard thing. It's become a kind of, I would call it a fad among evangelical Protestants in the last several decades to reject that and say, well, there's no eternal generation or whatever. But up until up until it was like 16 or 1700s, no one denied that. And then even after that, the people who did deny it, everybody thought were heretics until like the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it's only been in the last century that people have, in America and among evangelicals, have decided, well, yeah, maybe the Son and Spirit aren't eternally begotten and spirited or whatever. But anyway, that part of it is really just standard. The other part of monarchical Trinitarianism is just, so that's why the word God in the New Testament and in early church fathers is used to refer to the Father primarily.
And Craig has this one of his sentences. He has like a 2-sentence definition of Trinitarianism. I believe there's one God, and then there are
And
3 who are properly called God.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a little bit unclear to me what properly means. And I think maybe part of his disagreement with you is that you seemingly have a higher proper sense for the Father, that it to the exclusion of the Son and the Spirit. And
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess I've always kind of thought of his like properly called God is, maybe I've just kind of thought of that as shorthand for like really do have the divine nature or something like that. Yeah, maybe it is kind of a linguistic issue or something, like he wants them to
whatever the highest sense of being called God is, that's the proper
Yeah.
sense, and all 3 of
It's
them
such a
need it.
strange idea to me that the difference between orthodoxy and heresy would be purely a matter of semantics. You know what I mean? And that's the thing. That's what gets me about Hasker, is because Hasker believes in the monarchy of the Father. He just doesn't want to go so far as to say, okay, so yeah, God equals Father. That's why that's going on in the New Testament and early church fathers. But there's no reason he should. I mean, it's just like, why wouldn't you? Why should there's really nothing. It's completely unclear why he wouldn't say. Well, the only thing that he really, I mean, that he says, well, if you say that the Father is God and the Son and the Spirit are also, equally divine, then you have to say that in addition to God, there's 2 other divine persons in addition to God, and that would be awful. But it's like, but if you say that the Trinity is God and that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are divine persons, you have to say there's 3 divine persons other than God. Right? So, I mean, it doesn't solve anything. That's one of the things I think is so weird about some of the criticisms from Hasker and Craig, is that like the shift from the Father to the Trinity doesn't actually solve the problems that they bring up. Like they bring up an alleged problem, but it's like it doesn't get any better by identifying God with the Trinity, and in some cases, it just makes it worse. So it's like I don't really get it, but yeah, Hasker. The other thing that he and I sort of, I mean, I don't know, I just pointed out to him, he tried to kind of skirt around the issue of the filioque. And a lot of people do that because they just, I don't know why, but they think they want, say what?
Big tent.
Yeah, they want to be big tent, and they maybe they just want not be so committed to, I don't know, whatever. But I just don't think that really you can. Because if certain metaphysics and certain model of the Trinity is going to commit you to the filioque, and certain models and certain metaphysics, especially your view about what the intra-Trinitarian relations are going to exclude the filioque. And some views will be compatible with either, but you have to take a certain kind of metaphysical view to get that result too. So I just don't think you can kind of divorce, talking about your model of the Trinity from getting into the issue of the filioque.
Mm-hmm. All right. So what did you think of Dale Tuggy and his sections and your interactions with him in the book?
Yeah, I just converted to Unitarianism by the end of the
book. Oh, well,
book.
great. I was hoping to take credit for that, Beau, but if Dale has
to. No, it was
Dale.
I was just like, yeah, you're probably right. That was my last. No, I mean, I like I like the argument that he gave. I mean, as a philosopher, I can say I think it's a well-constructed argument. I like the fact that in this chapter, he's moving away from like deductive arguments to a probabilistic argument, which I like. I think that's, I mean, you kind of have to do that if you're primarily talking about like biblical exegesis or something. But I like that he framed it that way, because I think he's right. Like you can make anything consistent. I mean, almost any view, you can find a way to make it logically consistent. And certainly when you're talking about an interpretation of a text, like you can almost always find a way to interpret the text so that it's compatible with your view. So I like that he's kind of explicitly saying, look, just to say this is compatible with Trinitarianism misses the point, right? This is a probabilistic argument. You need to tell me why, this would be more likely on a Trinitarian view than a Unitarian view, and so forth. So I like that part of it. And of course, I agree with, I don't know how many of his 20.
A fair amount of his facts are simpatico with you against.
Yeah, I mean, like half of what he says is saying like, well, it's the Father that's God in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. I'm like, yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm. But I mean, yeah, when it comes to the things where, so like for me, he's just supporting monarchical Trinitarianism, or half of it, when he talks about God as the Father.
It's really only the Christology facts that are cutting, I mean, it's between really you and Dale, not the tridology stuff.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, there, I just kind of, I didn't get into addressing it in a lot of detail, because I just felt like Craig's arguments to me seemed pretty persuasive. That, and also I didn't recall really that, I'd have to go through all of them again, I guess. But I mean, to some extent, it seemed like a lot of it was kind of, I mean, not like argument from silence in the sense of like the fallacy, but I mean, like, there is a legitimate way to argue from silence. Like, if this person believed Jesus was divine, he probably would have said it right here, and he didn't, right? And that was some of what he was doing, was kind of like, well, it seems like the main thesis of this gospel or this epistle, like, is not the divinity of Christ or anything about the Trinity. And it just seems like if it was important, it would be. Which I will grant that's, so it's not, I'm not saying it's a fallacy, like that's evidence.
But it'll turn into a probabilistic argument, not a smackdown, right, 100% proof argument.
I just think it's not super strong evidence. And I think on the whole, when you sort of add it all up, I think the evidence is more on the side that they probably did think Jesus was divine. I think that, I mean, I've always said, like, if someone is like an actual, classical Arian or something, like if someone wanted to say, well, maybe the New Testament authors were just Arian, like, I mean, maybe, like, I'm happy to say, I'd be happy to say, like, if if you're trying to look at the evidence in the New Testament to decide between like Orthodox and Arian, or if you're looking at the pre-Nicene Fathers, like, I mean, I obviously think
it doesn't speak
goes
to the
for
divisions between those views very
what
specifically.
not
So
not
it's
super strongly. So I mean, like, in other words, if someone's an Arian, I'm happy to at least say like, well, okay, fine. I mean, maybe we just disagree. We see things kind of differently.
you see, you're not
Once
making
you
William Lane Craig feel happy with that sort of comment.
No, yeah, no, but I mean, the point being,
you're
like,
heightening his
those
suspicions
sorts of
about
views
you.
are closer to each other, right, than what Dale's view is going to be. So and I know, I mean, I know this is
Although,
kind of your view too, but anyway, I don't find it very, I didn't find that part of it very persuasive, and kind of on the whole, given when you take all of the evidence into account, I just think the New Testament authors. I mean, part of my criticism, my argument to Dale in my chapter where I write criticizing his view is I write about the theophanies and stuff. I think that it's clear that the New Testament authors think that Jesus was the theophany figure in the Old Testament. I guess like Michael Servetus though, so maybe.
although it like I said, it's a little tricky with Michael Servetus, but kind of. I guess on the theophany problem, here's one problem that I see with your solution to the theophany problem is the Jesus becoming the mediator of both covenants problem. Because if Jesus was the theophany figure at Sinai, then he is the mediator of the first covenant. Whereas the book of Hebrews, I'll just say, is about as clear as crystal clear can be that Jesus is the mediator of the second covenant, contra to him being the mediator of the first covenant. And that's a difference between the covenants.
Yeah, but the author of Hebrews, I think, has this view that was not uncommon at the time in Judaism. So I mean, there's this view that like all 613 different commandments actually came like through different angels, and it's kind of, so it's from whoever the person on Sinai was, but they like really it kind of comes through different angels, and then it's put together by Moses, right?
I suspected that might be your answer, but you're basically saying there's an extra layer of mediation or something.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's what he says. He says that a mediator implies like more than one. I forget how he puts it, but I mean, basically, it seems like what he's saying is, yeah, you have to, when there's you've got a bunch of angels, being sent to give different individual mitzvot. You've got to have a mediator to kind of tie it together, and right, which that was a view. I mean, I don't know. Anyway, that's a view that some people had. I think that's what the author of Hebrews thinks.
Basically, that there was the Son intermediating between the Father, but still angels intermediating between Moses and the Son.
I've never really quite wrapped my head around why you need a bunch of created angels to do that. But anyway, I mean, it seems like that's what he's referencing. I don't know.
Okay. So let's see here. One thing so I did this with Dale's facts. Like he's got 20 facts, and I put his facts and William Lane Craig's rebuttal to the facts into a not yet released Google Chat GPT competitor. I'll say that.
Okay.
And said, all right, give each of these facts a probability, a likelihood ratio, basically, of Unitarianism versus Trinitarianism.
Nice. Yeah, nice.
Like trying to formally Bayesify what Dale was doing. Because I mean,
you
Dale's
just
argument,
ask an AI to estimate the probabilities.
Yeah, so because I'm like, no one will trust me if I do this.
Yeah.
So, like, all right, AI, and I said there are, let's see here, 3 categories, or there are 5 categories basically that you can put a fact into for a given view. You could say it's perfectly compatible. you can say it's highly likely, medium likely, low likely, or completely incompatible with a view. And so give the highest one 100%, the lowest one 0%. So those are either 0% would be a defeater. Low is 10%, medium is 50, high is 90. Right. And so you can say a given fact, you can give them one of the 5 categories for both Trinitarianism and Unitarianism.
Right.
And so if it gets a high likelihood for Unitarianism, but say a low likelihood for Trinitarianism, that's 90 over 10. That's a 9 to 1.
Good Bayes factor.
Bayes factor. Right. And then you can get Bayes factors for all 20 facts. And like the number was like, I don't know, in the bagillia trillions of to 1 for Unitarianism. But I was like, but wait a minute, not all of these facts are independent of each other, right? In order to multiply facts together, they have to be independent. So I turned them into 4 categories. I said facts about God, facts about Father, facts about Son, and facts about Spirit, basically. And I'm going to count those as 4 independent categories. And so give me an odds ratio kind of, and I categorized all the facts into those 4 categories. I'm like, all right, now give a Bayes factor for each of the 4 categories, and we'll treat them as independent, but you can use all of the facts within a category to come up with a sum total category level Bayes factor. And I forget what it was, but it was still extremely high for Unitarianism. And then I said, okay, do it contra monarchical Trinitarianism. And like we kind of already mentioned, a lot of the God facts are indiscriminate, basically, between Unitarianism and monarchical Trinitarianism. Like the fact that 99% of the time God is the Father in the New Testament is equally, was the same category for both, was like perfectly compatible for both. So it's a moot factor. And really the only things that then separated monarchical Trinitarianism from Unitarianism were the Christology facts. And then there was, I think Dale had one fact was like, we never hear about the eternal generation or personhood of the Spirit. Maybe those were 2 facts, right? There's no description of the eternal generation of the Spirit, and there are facts that are contra the personality of the Holy Spirit. And so that gave, some, it was relatively mild. It was like 2 to 1 or something like that for the pneumatological facts. But still, the Christological facts were quite high. But what I didn't do is I didn't put like your theophany problem or other.
I was going to say, if you start taking in the theophany problem and some other stuff.
Because basically, the only way to argue with Dale's framework, if you accept the framework itself, is to come up with more and more plausible Trinitarian interpretations of Dale's facts to try and raise their category, or to add new facts in that tilt in the other direction and say maybe Dale didn't include all relevant facts or something like that.
Did you?
The likelihood ratio for monarchical Trinitarianism to Unitarianism was something like in the thousands. I think it was maybe 2,000 to 1, but that was way better than the trillion to 1 or something.
I would want to see. I'd have to see the details on all that. Did you include a hypothesis that the New Testament's just inconsistent?
No, I did not do that.
You should try that.
Well, so why do you think that seems like a very troubling conclusion?
I guess so. Well, I mentioned this, remember that thing we did with Isaiah back a million years ago or whatever. And I mentioned this then, and both of you kind of resisted this. This is a huge issue that I super duper fault all apologists for doing. And you should know, you're a data scientist, right? So, you know good and well, if you've got, if you've only got 2 possibilities, right? Probability is, it's a zero-sum game, right? Like if you've just got 2 options, then if I just give evidence against your view, then that automatically raises the probability of my view, right? If we've got a third guy in there, right, then I can give evidence that's just against your view. So your view, the posterior probability goes down. You lose some of the probability pie chart, But where does that probability go? I mean, it might go towards my view, or it might go towards the other guy's view. It might only go towards the other guy's view, or it might go, even if it goes sort of 50-50, like a lot of times what's going to happen is like, okay, I give a bunch of evidence against your view, you give a bunch of evidence against mine, but really the net effect is just that we've lowered both of our probabilities and this other one's gone way up.
That there's a contrary report. Like you could say the Bart Ehrman view or something like that.
Yeah.
We'll throw the synoptics to the biblical Unitarians.
Right.
We'll throw the Gospel of John to the monarchical Trinitarians, and we'll split the epistles of Paul between genuine and non-genuine.
Right. Yeah.
And we'll say that there are different Christologies. The thing that I wonder about that,
some people are Orthodox, some are Arian, some are just confused.
Some are biblical tinge. Yeah. And the problem with that view is, so it could do well on the likelihood part of the function, but one should wonder if it should be given the same prior probability because it's a more complicated hypothesis or something like that. And because the more complicated your hypothesis, the more pieces, the more parameters in your model.
How is it more complicated?
Because it has different pieces being different, right? And it's like, we're going to call this over here different from this over here,
and pieces are different, things are different. I mean,
but if instead of treating all the data as same, you have to say which parts of the data are different from each other, and those are hyperparameters or something like that in the function of your model.
I don't buy that at all. I mean, that it's not clear why. I mean, I guess like that maybe there's some a priori reason to think like the early members of a new religion or something would generally be on the same page about.
Right. You could say something like John knew Paul.
Like, look, you've got a Johannine community in Ephesus and this community. So, you've got people in different parts of the world, and maybe they, I don't know. I mean, you do have things too. I mean, there can be new religions that quickly splinter into factions and things. I mean, I'd grant, maybe there's some, greater prior probability that it's all going to kind of turn out to be consistent. But in any case, I mean, even if you start with even if you sort of give, let's give Trinitarians like 49% prior probability, Unitarians 49%, and like 2% to Bart Ehrman or something. I mean, if you've got Bayes factors in the thousands or whatever, it's not a little bit hard to get it from 1% up to, beating out the other ones.
But like, for example, like the reason why the hypothesis is more complicated is like, say you're looking at some given fact or something like that. Under a Unitarian hypothesis or a Trinitarian hypothesis, there's a relatively clear way of how to evaluate the fact, right? I've got the same hypothesis for all New Testament facts. But for a Bart Ehrman thing, I don't know, how would Bart Ehrman even handle the fact like 99% of the time the word God refers to the Father in the New Testament, if he's splitting up his New Testament into different views or something like that?
Just that they agreed on that. They all believe that.
Right. And so, but then, okay, how do you evaluate the fact that the synoptics and the book of Acts in particular seem to emphasize Jesus having received the ability extrinsically to do his miracles or something like that?
Yeah, if I'm Bart Ehrman, I'd say, because that's what those authors believed.
Right. But then you've got these extra parameters in your model that are like, over here, evaluate this way, over here, evaluate this way, over here,
I'm just asking what an author believed. Why did Luke say blah, blah, blah? Because that's what Luke believed, because that's what people do.
But then what particular fact would benefit the multiple Christology hypothesis compared to a coherent Christology hypothesis?
Well, I mean, you'd take something like John says in the beginning was the Logos, and Logos was Theos, and sounds on the surface, like he thinks that Jesus was this pre-existent divine being that becomes incarnate. And, you know, if you think the Gospel of Mark looks like, he just thinks Jesus was a human, and when he was baptized, he kind of got some Holy Spirit juice in him or whatever. I mean, that's what Mark believed.
So then you get the benefit of the highest likelihood in each circumstance.
Yeah,
basically.
you just go with whatever. I mean,
and that, but to me, that feels like you're like what I would call in statistics, like you're peeking at the answer or something like that. Like you're sort of
is that
over
is that a technical term?
a technical term, like you're overfitting.
That far in statistics,
I guess the technical term would be you're overfitting, right?
Oh, well, I mean,
Because you're sort of
is
like
overfitting a problem when you're doing history?
I think so. It could be.
I mean, I know it's a problem if you're trying to have a predictive,
right. If you're trying to have a
model
predictive thing. And it's like, okay, what does Bart Ehrman's model do if we find some other early Christian writing? You know, like let's say, oh, new archaeological discovery. We found Third Corinthians, you know, or something like that. Or maybe that one's actually not so hard for him to deal with, because he'll just say that if it's authentically Paul, I have how to deal with authentically Paul. But let's say we find the authentic Gospel of Andrew or something like that. And it's from the Christian community in Sicily. And you don't have anything in your model that tells you what the Christian community of Sicily's Christology is.
Right.
So, right, you know,
so you
like
just look at the text and see what it says.
But you see, he can't predict it because his model is overfitted.
Well, okay, yeah, then I think I wouldn't worry about that, because I mean, that's not really what historians are trying to do. They're not trying to predict like what would happen if we dug up another document, right? They're just trying to say, based on the available evidence, here's the most likely story about the past. I mean, it's true that their view, I mean, a reconstruction of history will make certain predictions, right? So yeah, you know, if I think that the Markan, I don't know, there's a Markan community or the Matthean community, you know, was biblical Unitarian or something. Well, then that predicts that if we dug something else up that was from the Matthean community, it should be consistent with that, probably. And if you found something that was just explicitly Trinitarian or something, you have to go, well, I mean, maybe we were wrong about this interpretation. So you'd go back and revise your, you'd update your probabilities, right?
And like this is part of like even like a super hyper Bart Ehrman one could be like, hey, you know, different chapters of the same gospel, no need to think that they were all written by the same author, right? And so I can just take the highest likelihood for every single fact and just completely, every time I encounter a new fact, I add a new parameter. Oh, by the way, Matthew 28, that was someone else, right? And that's not the rest of Matthew. And so every single time I encounter a fact, I'm adding a new parameter to my model such that I always get the highest likelihood for an individual verse. And I feel like there's something disingenuous about that methodology.
Well, so if you've got a book that claims to be like a single work of a single author, there's some probability that that's what happened. I mean, like without any other, I mean, I would say anyway, without any other evidence than that, you should probably assume that's the case. Usually when scholars go in and try to start chopping the Bible up, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of some of that stuff, but I mean, the idea is just there are reasons to think that these were different documents or what. I mean, so people will go in and do like stylometric analyses, which are statistical, right? I mean, you just go in and look, you can say, well, in these verses, the person has really long sentences and they have this kind of complex sentence structure a lot. And over here, there's these really short sentences. They use different grammatical constructions,
pronoun counts and stuff like
that.
Yeah,
you can count up like what's the vocabulary going on here, what's the frequency of all these different words, and this things using different words, and so I mean, that is evidence that it was written by a different author. I mean, it could be maybe it's strong or weak or whatever, but I mean, there is some evidence. So if you have stylistic sorts of evidence that this looks like it, I mean, this happens for me just grading undergraduate papers at the end of the semester, right? I mean, just I'm a finely tuned Bayesian machine. I guess I can look at something and be like, okay, this was ChatGPT. This is not written by a human. This was written by a human, but not a 18-year-old kid in my philosophy class, right? So, you can kind of tell, right? Or you can tell like this looks like it was written by someone different from this part, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I think there's ways you can argue for that, but the reason I bring this up though is not because I want to argue for the inconsistency of scripture or something like that, but the thing that concerns me is that the way I call these verse wars sometimes, like the way some of these apologetics things work is it's like, well, I'm going to stack up a bunch of evidence for my view here, and it's decreasing the probability of your view. And then the other person's like, well, I'm going to stack up a bunch of evidence here, and well, I'm going to stack up even more evidence. And if you really look at it, the net effect of all of it is not that you have shown your view to be more likely than the other guy. It's the net effect of it is that you have jointly lowered the probability of both of your views, like down to nothing. And by far, even if you start out with 1% prior probability for inconsistency, like that's gone through the roof now. Like that's really what you've done. And what that means is if you really wanted to be a good apologist, if you're really trying to defend this, one view, you don't need to, once you've made a case for your view, like a positive case for your view, you
need to focus on the data points that are hardest against you and
exactly.
soften
what
them,
you need to
either
do is
win them or at least soften
you have
them.
to undermine the other guy's stuff. And so why is your evidence actually not unlikely on my hypothesis?
So
and that's not what people do. So it's if you really look at it, it's like, well, you guys aren't, like, neither of you has defended your position. You've just both destroyed each other's position. And it's things need to be approached in a kind of different way from what people do a lot of times. So I would just say, what the most important thing, I can say, Dale's kind of made a case. He's made a case for his view. Craig's made a case for his view. I've made a case. But the critical thing at that point is not just like rack up more evidence in my favor. The critically important thing is show how all the stuff that you guys point out is consistent with my view. And so honestly, I do think monarchical Trinitarianism does the best job of that, because I think Dale has a good argument for the Father is God in the New Testament. I don't really even know what Craig's response to that was. They didn't have a concept.
Well, it's totally fine for them to call the Father God, in my view. So what's the problem with that, right? He didn't really seemingly address the core of the critique, if I remember correctly.
Which is like, why is it with this frequency?
Right. He just said, he said, oh, it's compatible with my view, but he didn't address the odds ratio question.
Right.
Like, another thing that I did was trying to make this a little bit numerical. Is so Craig brings up, it was 7 or 8 times where Jesus is called God in the New Testament or something like that. And so I looked at the frequency of people who are called God. What percentage of the time that you're mentioned are you called God? Basically, what's your God hit frequency, right? And you can be like, all right, Moses gets referenced in the Bible a few hundred times, let's say, something like that. And he gets called God 3 times ish or something like that. So it's like 0.5%, something like that. King Hezekiah seemingly gets called God once, maybe twice, if you include Psalm 9 or Isaiah 9:6. That one's open for interpretation. Let's say once or twice. All right. King Hezekiah gets mentioned less than 100 times. So it's about 1%. Satan gets mentioned a bunch of times. He gets called God of this world once. So he's like, around 1%. So of all of the non-God people, there was a hit rate of around like 1% of those people who get called God. What's interesting is like Baal. I did a couple other characters, like Baal is something like he's in like the 10 or 20s, but he's normally called a false god or something like that. He's getting called God when he's mentioned, right? So he's like in the 10 or 20s. the Father is something like 50 to 60% of the time he's mentioned, he's called God. But, you know, sometimes if he's called the Father without God, right, then he's being referenced, but without having God applied to him, or if he's called the Almighty or the Most High, right, there's a couple other ways of referring to the Father that don't include the word God. But most of the time, he's either called God or God the Father. So it's like 50 to 60% of the time, his God hit rate. And then you do Jesus, and he's like 0.5% or something like that, or like, you know,
just in the New Testament specifically,
in the New Testament,
Father, it's called Father 56%. Yeah.
And so that seems to classify Jesus. If you're just doing some sort of classification algorithm, his God hit rate is similar to humans or other non-God figures, as opposed to being similar to the Father. And that would seemingly be a statistical argument against Craig's divinity of Christ argument or something like that.
Yeah, I like that. I would wonder what the Yahweh hit rate is for for Jesus and for the Father in the New Testament. I think it would be interesting to compare, like, how many times is the Father clearly referred to as Kyrios, meaning Yahweh, in the New Testament. And I would bet that it's a lot lower than Jesus.
Right. The Lord, right? What percentage of the time does the word Lord? Or you would have to specify the Lord as opposed to just Lord, because there's like other uses of Lord for, like, I don't know. I forget. There's a handful of other people in the New Testament who are called Lord in sort of like the master kind of sense.
Yeah. Two things about that. So one, I mean, I don't know if this, I don't know how hard and fast the rule this is, but typically, like in the Septuagint, when Kyrios means Yahweh, it would be without the definite article.
Interesting.
Because in Greek, you don't use a definite article with the name of a god. So like Socrates, you would say the Socrates, but Zeus, you just say Zeus.
Interesting.
Because the definite article originally was more like a demonstrative, so it's like this Socrates, you know, like, because there could be more than one Socrates or Plato, whatever. So like Socrates, a lot of, I think actually at one point you'd maybe introduce Socrates without an article, and then every other time you refer to him, you'd have the article that Socrates, this Socrates.
Yeah.
But a god is just, you know who Zeus is. You don't need to say this Zeus. It's just Zeus.
But biblical Unitarianism can handle the Jesus being called Kyrios pretty easily. You just say that that's the name that he was given. He was given the name above all names. What's the name above all names? Well, the Lord. And that's what he's given. Then for the name he has inherited is greater than theirs being the angels, right? So Jesus inherits the name the Lord. So Jesus can be called the Lord, and it's perfectly compatible.
Is who is Yahweh in the Old Testament, right? You would expect that he would be referred to in the New Testament as Kyrios.
Yeah, and he is a handful of times, right? I think a majority of times.
That's the question, right? What's the hit rate? Right.
Yeah, well, what's the hit rate? But like I said, it might not create an odds ratio against Unitarianism if the Unitarian hypothesis can say Jesus gets given the name of the Lord, and so he can be called Lord without any incompatibility to our view, even if, say, 70% of Kyrios hit rate is to Jesus as opposed to the Father or something like that.
But is that what you? I mean, it's compatible. Is that what you would expect?
Well, I mean, if Jesus is the one who now is referred to by that title, I don't see why it would be different than what we would expect.
Well, so the idea would be something like the name gets sort of transferred.
Yeah, inherited and bequeathed to Jesus. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. But I do. I would just say I think it's important to keep a null hypothesis in mind, or keep in mind like a possibility that it's just incoherent or contradictory, because otherwise, I mean, you do just get this approach that where like people aren't really doing. I mean, the critical question really is like, what view does the best job of accommodating all of the different facts, right? And without just sort of ad hoc, kind of adjustments,
Right.
right? It just kind of naturally accommodates the different bits of evidence.
And it would be, I struggle to think of how the right way to trade off between the Ehrman hypothesis and say a coherent hypothesis. Right? Like, let's say biblical Unitarianism can give a good account of John 1, but will still give a higher likelihood ratio, a Bayes factor. We'll give like a 3-to-2 ratio or something like that on John 1 to monarchical Trinitarianism, but it's not too strong against Unitarianism because we have a compelling alternative, or Colossians 1 or Philippians 2, right? Pick your favorite ones, right? Biblical Unitarianism gives a plausible that sort of softens the blow of the kind of main Trinitarian ones. And then we've got a lot of ones that we really like. But Bart Ehrman could still come in and be like, I get the best of both houses on this one. How do you trade off the math on that? What penalty does Bart Ehrman need to pay for his incoherence and his ad hoc verse splitting?
Well, it's I don't get that. I don't think it's ad hoc at all. I mean, if I think about it this way, I mean, if you weren't a Christian, or if you were talking about a different religion, I mean, suppose we were talking about like, suppose we were talking about Hinduism or Buddhism or something, and it's like there's different Buddhists or different Hindu, documents or scriptures or whatever written by different people, and they seem to contradict each other. Like, what would you think?
Well, it depends on how strong the contradiction is, right? And if it's mild contradiction, or if it's, it's like, well, maybe on the most plausible reading, it seems contradictory, but sometimes, people like, you can split apart an individual person with, incoherence or something like that, or even different phases of Craig's Trinity theory in the last 3 years or something.
But I mean, right. Bart Ehrman could say, one author might be contradicting himself too. I mean, that's
and that's my point. Is like, what's the mathematical leniency that you should give to a coherent hypothesis if it struggles with a couple things here or there? Like, seemingly we could all imagine if there's a directly contradictory one, like God is 3 persons. God is definitely not 3 persons. Right. Okay. Those are completely incompatible. But if there's a couple times where an alternative hypothesis has a higher probability than yours, I don't think that means that suddenly, as soon as there's 1 or 2 things that your competing hypothesis beats you on, that the logical conclusion is incoherence. There does have to be a trade-off there.
Well, I mean, there's something called the principle of charity, right? I mean, typically people don't contradict themselves. Most things that people believe are true, or at least plausible. Most inferences that people make are valid most of the time. So, if there's some ambiguity, you want to favor the view that
right.
Turn out. But that you have to keep in mind, that's with respect to an individual person, right? Most individuals don't contradict themselves.
Well, Bart Ehrman's hypothesis is that the Gospel of John has contradictory Christologies within it, right? And that, okay, so John chapter 5, that's a low Christology. John chapter 1, that's a high Christology, right? Like that sort of thing. And so I feel like there needs to be some sort of penalty for.
Well, yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I mean, you should set the prior probability low. That a single author will just blatantly contradict themselves or make crazy, wild, invalid inferences or something like that. So yeah, it's low. You ought to have pretty good evidence that this is definitely contradictory. If there's a way to reconcile it all, you should prefer, the
and so that's what I'm saying, that there needs to be
apply to like different people. There's no a priori reason to think 2 different people
Well, if they
agree
knew
about.
each other and shared a same influence and a same goal and viewed themselves as part of the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
community,
sure,
then
sure.
we can assume sort of like a collective, charity of agreement. And maybe that's not quite as strong as an individual
Yeah,
principle of
no, I'd
charity.
agree with that. Yeah, there's some amount of prior probability that,
Hmm.
like the 12 disciples would agree about
Yeah.
most stuff. But I mean, my issue is just if you're taking a sort of secular, neutral sort of approach to things, right? I mean, um, there's no a priori reason to think that Jesus necessarily taught anything about, the metaphysics of intertrinitarian relations, or, or whatever, right? I mean, you might just have things where, like, oh, this guy didn't say anything about it, and then it kind of became an issue. Or, I mean, I mean, maybe Jesus was a dude, and people later decided he was divine, but they kind of, that maybe that's something that kind of came around later, but then there were different ways, different sort of background Jewish theologies that they fit that in. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you could get at least some disagreement, especially once the apostles kind of go to different places or Christianity just spreads to different places. If it spreads pretty far, pretty wide early on, like you could get different things. I mean, you certainly, just think about like Gnosticism, right? I mean, you get a lot of nutty, different, weird things with the Gnostics.
Hmm.
But I mean, I'm not saying I buy into all that. I'm just saying that's, even if you, my biggest issue is that even if you set a really, really low prior probability to all, if you just, I mean, we could give Bart Ehrman the biggest penalty, we want to start with, but the net effect of, me giving a bunch of evidence that shows Unitarianism can't be true because Jesus is divine in the New Testament or whatever. And then, okay, but you can't be right because God's the Father and this, and the net effect of that, if you just keep stacking up positive evidence, right? The
Hmm.
net effect is just both of those things
And
go
my
down.
question is how much do I need to undermine your evidence before I beat Bart Ehrman? Right? If I can
Yeah, yeah.
soften the
Well,
blow
yeah.
on your evidence,
Yeah.
and
Well, the
even
main
give you
thing
a
is just
positive,
that my main criticism is just that that is what you need to do. It's not, I mean,
yeah.
you can set the numbers. I mean, I'm a Bayesian, I'm a subjectivist, so you set your prior probabilities however you want.
Like I feel like if you're giving Bart
Right.
Ehrman 1 to 1,000 odds off the bat, I can beat that. But if you're only penalizing him 1 to 2 or something like that,
You
then
mean just
that's
like you're
tricky.
setting the prior probability to like
Yeah.
0.1% or something?
Yeah, that I
Yeah.
feel like I can bring your positive evidence down enough where I can
Yeah.
beat Bart Ehrman on that comparison. But if you give him say 1 to 2, or something like that,
Right.
a penalty, then
Right.
that'll be hard to overcome. And that is exactly my question is how much
Yeah.
penalty does he deserve for
Well, that's
a
just, I mean, that's just
contradictory?
the
Yeah.
issue of kind of, that's the philosophy of
Yeah.
probability, right? I mean, how
Right.
do you set prior probabilities? And that
Mhm.
probably is the reason why, that's probably, I think that's at the root of a lot of disagreements about how to interpret the Bible, or like, do
Yeah.
miracles really happen or whatever. I think a lot of times it's just, I set the probability that somebody comes back from the dead at almost zero. So you'd need Polaroids, you need video. I mean, like
Mhm. I want to talk to
it's like,
him.
well, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't have that much evidence, right? But if you think like, well, yeah, that's, unlikely to be true, but let me look at the evidence, and I don't know if there's like pretty good evidence and there's not really any fantastic evidence against it. It just the prior probability. I think it's actually a really interesting issue, because I think that it does happen a lot with miracles and things like this, that like you'll have an issue where it's like, okay, this sounds unlikely, but all the evidence points towards, like, all the evidence we have points towards this thing really happening, really being true. We don't really have any evidence against it. It's just the sort of thing that sounds so preposterous, like. And
Mhm.
so I think it's an interesting scenario. Like, what do you do with that? Where like, when there's not actually positive evidence against something, And
like
the only thing
telepathy,
you got
right?
really is the prior setting the prior and maybe it does seem like the prior probability should be low. Like I'm not going to just believe if someone's like, oh yeah, Bob rose from the dead the other day. Like, oh okay. I mean, like I'm not going to just believe it off the bat, but I mean, it is an interesting thing when it's just like the only thing against this view is the prior probability.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's just the I don't know. Yeah, what do you do? I mean, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyway, that's kind of a whole other issue.
That's interesting. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Do you have any sort of closing thoughts or any other things you wanted to say about the book?
No, I mean, we kind of didn't get into much of what we did in the book, but I thought it was an interesting conversation. So I won't add anything else to it, and that was good.
All right. Well, thanks, Beau. I appreciate your time and fun to talk to you again. We hadn't talked for a while, so it was good to sort of
Yeah,
catch
it's
up.
good to see you again too. So
Yeah. All right.
all right,
Well, I'm sure that we'll be in touch again sometime in the future.
all right.